Welcome to our workshop today. This is an global ISEE workshop for the 2021 meeting that is just happening now because we had decided last year for the annual meeting that we'll have the workshops virtual throughout the year. So this is an ISEE 2021 workshop on strategies for enhancing peer review as a reviewer and author. I will introduce Dr. Catherine Callahan in just a second, but I would just like to say that we just agreed that should you have any questions or comments, feel free to unmute or type those in the chat during the presentation if you feel comfortable doing so. And then also there will be some time both in the middle and at the end of the presentation for Q&A. So you have many options to interact. Please do so. And without further ado, Dr. Catherine Callahan is a science editor in environmental health perspectives. And in her role at EHP, she reviews submissions related to epidemiologic studies. And today, this workshop is on strategies for enhancing peer review, both as a reviewer and as an author. So with that, Dr. Callahan, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. As stated, please feel free to join in and ask questions and discuss your own experiences with peer review, either as a reviewer or as an author. This presentation is being recorded, but if you would like the slides for your reference, I've left my email here as well. So I just wanted to ask a few questions just to get a sense of who's in the room. If you wanted to just use the raised hand. Oh, okay, sorry. If you just wanted to use the raise hand feature to respond, yes for the yes or no questions, and then for multiple choice, I'll give you a chance. But if you've had formal training in peer review previously, if you could just raise your hand on Zoom if you're comfortable, that would be great. Okay. And if you've ever reviewed a paper for a peer-reviewed journal, if you could raise your hand for that, that would be. Okay, so I'm seeing more raised hands for having reviewed a paper. If you haven't reviewed a paper by yourself, have you ever done a mentored peer review with maybe your supervisor or another colleague? Thank you. And then if you're a student, if you could raise your hand, that would be great. Okay. If you're an early career researcher within 5 years of completing a terminal degree. I would also use this opportunity to mention that EHP is working on a lot of resources for early career researchers, so you can check our website for those. And then if you're beyond an early career researcher. Thank you. All right. So for today's workshop, thanks for participating. I really appreciate it. So today, first, we're going to go over the goals of peer review and then discuss some potential ethical dilemmas and biases as a reviewer, and then talk about reviewing a manuscript as well as responding to reviews as an author. I also think at this point, I should note that each of these topics could be a longer workshop in and of itself. So this is sort of a brief overview, and really interested in hearing feedback from the group about what you would like to discuss more in detail. So again, feel free to jump in at any time. And if things feel a little cursory, we can discuss things that are more interest to you and put some other things aside. That's totally fine. So now I'd like to hear from the group. What are some of the goals of peer review? We all know from this little meme that, it's a very iterative process and things can look very different by the end of peer review. So does anyone want to share what they feel the goals of peer review are?
Looks like David has his hand raised.
I think that might be a holdover from the survey time. Okay, so some of the goals of peer review in my experience are first to inform the journal editor of the merits and limitations of the paper you're reviewing, as well as to help the editorial team to decide how the paper should proceed. So should the paper after your review be rejected? Should it be sent for revisions? Should these be major or minor revisions? Or eventually, after a few rounds of peer review, or at least one round, should the paper be accepted for publication? You should also be providing feedback to the authors that is constructive and helps them improve their paper. And when you're conducting peer review, you should consider how you feel when you receive reviews and try to be kind, constructive, and timely when reviewing. So just provide a brief overview of the peer review process at our journal. All papers undergo an initial screen by the editorial team, which includes science editors like myself, as well as our deputy editors and editor-in-chief. About 85% of the new submissions to EHP are rejected without peer review. And when we do this initial screen, we consider if the paper is in scope for the journal, the novelty of the paper, as well as the strength of the contribution to the scientific literature. If the paper is selected for further review, we send that to the associate editor, who may also recommend rejecting without sending for peer review, or they select and invite potential reviewers. Based on these reviewer comments, the AE will recommend a decision to the deputy editor, and then the EHP team will make the final decision. So when you receive an invitation to review, there are a few things you should consider before you accept this invitation. First of all, if you have the right expertise. If you're concerned about that you only know parts of the manuscript, or they're not as familiar with other sections, you can always contact the editor and ask them if that's okay. Oftentimes this happens at EHP where we're looking for an expert to review a certain portion of the manuscript, and we have other reviewers that can focus on other topics, so it's usually fine. But it's always good to talk to the editor before agreeing if you're concerned about your expertise. The other concerns are if you can meet the deadline. It's when you're thinking about submitting a manuscript, it can be a long wait. And if you're a reviewer, you don't want to hold things up, but you can request a short extension. But if you don't think you'll have the time to do a thorough review, it's better to decline as soon as possible versus missing the deadline and then eventually declining. There are also ethical considerations before agreeing to review that you should think about, including conflicts of interest. So a conflict of interest is a relationship that is relevant to the topic of the manuscript that might be perceived to be of value that could result in financial or professional or other personal gain or loss for you, members of your household, or your employer. If you feel you have a potential or perceived conflict, you should contact the associate editor before accepting the invitation. And then if it's determined that you can objectively evaluate the manuscript, you should also disclose this perceived conflict again when submitting your review comments and confirm that it did not influence your review. So this is the conflict of interest policy for EHP. Different journals may have different policies. So if you're concerned about a conflict of interest when reviewing for a different journal, it's best to check their website for the policies. Another ethical consideration during peer review, including before, another ethical consideration before and during the peer review process is confidentiality. So all aspects of the peer review process are confidential, including invitations. So even if you don't accept an invitation to review a manuscript, you should still treat that as confidential and don't share information on topics, studies, authors, or other details. If you do agree to review a manuscript and you wish to discuss this with a colleague, consult with the associate editor beforehand and acknowledge your colleague in the confidential comments to the editor. Also, EHP and other journals really encourage mentored peer review, such as if your supervisor asks you to review a manuscript with them. However, you should get this approved before sharing the manuscript with your mentee as well. Okay, so moving on to some biases in peer review. A bias that is a big concern is an implicit bias, such as an implicit attitude, stereotype, motivation, or assumption that it can occur without one's knowledge or intention, as well as confirmation bias, which is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. So first we'll talk about implicit bias. And you should always aim to remain unbiased by considerations related to nationality, religious or political beliefs, gender, or other characteristics of the authors. Other potential sources of implicit bias could be institutional affiliation, the discipline, seniority, or language proficiency. So implicit bias could cause reviewers to be more or less critical depending on the directions of their implicit bias. So for instance, when you're thinking about language proficiency and you're reviewing a paper that the list of authors is an international institution and the English language proficiency is sort of awkward, how much of your review would be impacted by the English language issues rather than the work itself? Conversely, if you're reviewing a paper by a very famous group of authors and you don't understand what they're doing, would you be more likely to think that this is due to your shortcomings of understanding the paper or problems with the work? So you can overcome implicit bias by first identifying your biases and then trying to adjust for them. There's several implicit bias tests out there on the internet. I've included a link for one here. You can also try to avoid scrutinizing the author's names and affiliations, even if you're reviewing for a journal that uses the single anonymous review method, such as EHP, where the reviewers are aware of the author's names. You should also try your best to set aside grammar issues when reviewing a manuscript. If it's a major hindrance to understanding the manuscript, you can reach out to the associate editor or just make one general comment. It's also in order to avoid committing microaggressions towards non-native English speakers. Instead of saying this work should be edited by a native English speaker, you should just say a more general statement about grammatical errors. Confirmation bias can impact how the authors interpret and present their results. So results consistent with the author's expectations are probably maybe given more weight or be interpreted using a different criteria. And it may also impact your review based on the existing biases that you have going into reviewing manuscript, or findings presented with more weights by the authors may dictate how you review the manuscript. So in order to avoid confirmation bias when reviewing manuscripts, the method that I try to do is to look at the figures and tables first, or read the methods and results before the discussion and think about what I would conclude from these results before thinking about how the authors are interpreting them. You should also consider reading the abstract last to avoid more confirmation bias based on what the authors select to present in the abstract. There are also different styles that may make confirmation bias more likely, depending on the journal, if they allow for declarative titles, such as smoking causes lung cancer, or combining the results and discussion section, or including the methods at the end or in a smaller font. But you should always try to avoid confirmation bias even with these formatting differences. So prior to you've received your review invitation and you determine that you don't have any conflicts of interest and you're ready to review, I recommend before reviewing to read the journal's website, policies, and any review checklist so that you're prepared for what you should be including in your review. And then also check the journal's requirements and author guidelines for the type of article you're reviewing. EHP has this new research letter format, and something that we've run into a few times is reviewers not understanding the limitations of that format. So we only allow 2 tables or figures and 10 citations, and then we'll get review reports where the reviewers are asking for more tables or figures or supplemental material, which is not allowed for that format. So if you're reviewing an article with a strict format, you should keep that in mind when drafting your review. If you're less familiar with the journal, you can also look at recently published papers to get a better sense of what they publish. So I recommend considering a two-phase approach to reviewing in order to increase your timeliness. The first read, you should summarize the research question and the contribution of your work. And this can be used as the summary statement in your review report. And then you should also identify any major or fatal flaws and consider if the paper is in scope for the journal. So a fatal flaw is something that cannot be fixed in the revision process. And if you find one in a paper, you might want to consider limiting your review to describing these fatal flaws. So does anyone have any examples of a fatal flaw that they would consider something that cannot be fixed in revising the paper and would lead them to recommend reject? So one example that I always use is if an author uses a biomarker in a case control study that's impacted by disease status, this would render the study pretty uninformative. Also, during your first read, if you're considering a paper and you feel that it's not in scope for the journal, should you limit your review to just describing that aspect? So what I would recommend is to first consider if the journal does an initial review. So at EHP, we review every paper that's submitted prior to sending out for peer review. And if we send it to a peer reviewer, we probably consider that it's in scope or borderline in scope. You could still note that you don't think that this is appropriate for the journal in the comments to the editor, but in this instance, a more complete review would be more helpful. If the journal doesn't do much initial review, then you could contact the editor and say, okay, I can review this, but I don't really think it's in scope, and see what they say. So if you decide to only see a question, Angelique?
Yes, it was for the previous slide. I just wanted to see if you were able to give an example of authors used a biomarker in a case control study. Could you give an example of that?
Yeah, so for instance, prior to my time as a science editor, I was working a lot in cancer research, especially kidney cancer. So kidney function is impacted when someone has kidney cancer, and a lot of biomarkers are also impacted or excreted through the kidneys. So if you were doing a case control study that wasn't nested, where you were recruiting cases and controls after disease diagnosis and measuring a biomarker such as PFAS, which are excreted in the kidney, you could falsely find an association, but it could be due to the buildup of PFAS due to poor kidney function instead of due to PFAS increasing kidney cancer risk. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, that makes totally perfect sense. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, this was a big issue because I was working on a nested case control study. So we were concerned that there might be some indolent kidney cancer that was impacting kidney function, which turned out to be less of an issue. But now at EHP, when I review new manuscripts, I think everyone rolls their eyes when there's anything kidney related because I bring it up a lot. But that's one example of what I would consider to be a fatal flaw. And also, I think something to think about is that that's for EHP, which has pretty high standards, but there could be a hypothesis generating study where you might be worried about that, but it's the first study of its kind. And so if it's more of a hypothesis generating study and caveated appropriately, that it still might be reasonable to include, but usually not as much. Does anyone have any other questions at this time? Okay. So if you find this paper has a fatal flaw and you don't think it's going to do very well moving forward, you don't think it's a useful contribution because of this fatal flaw that you've identified, then you could restrict your review to just describing that issue, which would reduce your effort. However, you should also be balanced when considering this approach, because if you misinterpret journal priorities, so for instance, using that example, if it was more of a hypothesis generating study, then your review is not as helpful to the editor, and the authors have less information to improve their paper. So even if the paper is rejected, the authors are probably going to submit it elsewhere, and they would still benefit from your feedback. However, this should be balanced, because a quick rejection with well-supported comments is probably better than a delayed rejection with more detailed comments. So in your second read, after you've determined that there aren't any major fatal flaws, you should identify major concerns and potential solutions, as well as to determine if the methods are sufficiently reported. A good rule of thumb I use is, could they be reproduced by another researcher with access to the study's data? And also, are the results completely reported? Oftentimes you'll see in the methods, authors describe an analysis and then it doesn't really make it into the results. You should also determine if the tables and figures are effective or understandable, and if does the discussion and conclusion agree with the results. So if you've read the methods and results before reading the discussion and conclusion, you can think about what you would include as the discussion or concluding statements and how well they agree with what the authors have presented. Finally, you should review the abstract and determine if it's in agreement with the rest of the text, as well as if there are things missing from the abstract or if the results are sort of cherry-picked. When you're drafting your comments to the authors, you should include an unbiased and well-informed assessment that will help the editors make a decision, as well as help the authors improve their work. So when you're thinking about major concerns, you should include potential solutions. When you're writing your comments to the authors, include positive as well as negative feedback. This will help the editors make their decision. If you only include negative feedback, the editors will think that the paper is not very good. Whereas if you thought the paper was pretty good, but you just had some suggestions, that's less clear if you don't include the positive feedback. It's helpful to the authors to include specific quotes, line numbers, as well as figure and table numbers. You should also number distinct comments instead of including combined summary comments, which will make it easier for the authors to provide a point-by-point response, as well as it'll make it easier on yourself when you're reviewing a revised version of this manuscript. And you should provide citations as needed, as well as to distinguish between necessary and optional comments. So when you're drafting your review, you should include both major and minor comments and distinguish between the two. So major comments are things you feel must be addressed or things that you think might take more time on behalf of the authors to resolve, whereas minor comments are more suggestions or straightforward revisions. It's okay to make global recommendations when you're thinking about wording or minor comments. So if you see a paper that's reporting the results of an observational study and they're using a lot of causal language, such as effect, you can just make a global comment telling them to revise the causal language instead of enumerating every instance. So does anyone have any examples of major comments to the authors that they would like to share? Okay, so one major comment that I see a lot is if there's an unsupported interpretation of the study's findings. So if the conclusion section is vastly out of touch with what happened, what the actual results are, that I would consider a major comment. Or if the authors are ignoring several null findings and only focusing on the one statistically significant finding, that is a major issue. If there's something wrong with the statistical models and the authors have to redo all of their analyses, I would consider that to be something that will be very time consuming and a major comment. Minor comments are more like something that a sensitivity analysis that you think might be helpful, or suggestions for future research that you think the authors could include in their discussion section. Most editorial software also includes a section for confidential comments to the author, to the editors. In this section, you would want to include a frank description of the strengths and limitations, as well as if you detect any possible ethics violations by the authors, such as a duplicate publication or plagiarism, undeclared conflicts of interest on behalf of the authors, or any other evidence of research misconduct. As a quick note here, if you run into a possible ethics violation, you should just include that into the comments to the editors and not discuss it with anyone else, because you want to maintain the confidentiality required by peer review. In the comments to authors, you should also include your rationale for recommendation. So you can recommend reject when you're reviewing a paper in your comments to the editors, but you shouldn't include in comments to the authors what your recommendation is, because it is the final decision of the editor if the paper should be rejected or revised. And when you recommend reject, you should also make sure that that agrees with your review. So if you write a review that only includes a few minor comments and then you recommend reject, that makes it harder for the editor to justify the decision. Also, if you have any thoughts on scope or reader interest, the comments to the editors are a good place to include those. So for example, if you review a paper that's reporting the results of a study that was similar to one that you published last year, and you notice several very familiar statements, and after reviewing your previously published paper, find that the statements in the discussion are verbatim from your paper, what should you do? Should you go tell your colleague about this? Should you write it in the confidential comments to the editor, or something else? Okay, so you would want to include this in the confidential comments to the editor with specific examples and not discuss it with anyone else to maintain that confidentiality. So there are also some things that you can do to save time when reviewing. Depending on the journal, you don't have to review the grammar or formatting. Some journals don't have copy or science editors, so then you might want to spend more time thinking about the grammar. If you're concerned about this, you can consult the reviewer guidelines or reach out to the editor and ask, and you can just say, I've noticed several grammar errors. Will this paper be copy edited? And if the paper is very incomprehensible, then you can contact the editor as soon as possible. If you notice a few minor issues, you can point them out, but you don't have to spend a lot of time enumerating minor issues if you know that this journal uses copy editors. However, you should point out grammar issues that have a substantive implication. So something like causal versus casual could be missed by the journal copy editor, and that would make the paper very confusing. So you should include that in your review. You also don't have to worry as much about adherence to journal formatting, especially if you're reviewing for a journal that you're not familiar with. You don't have to spend time determining if the figures and tables adhere to a journal's guidelines. As a quick note, sometimes we'll get comments from reviewers that say that they couldn't really see the figure, it was really blurry, and you sometimes do have to click a link to get to the higher resolution figure. If you can't interpret a table and figure, you can and should comment on that in your review. So I'd like to open it up now to have anyone has any questions about peer review as a reviewer, and then we'll move forward to talking about responding to reviews as an author. If anyone has any questions in the chat, or if you wanted to raise your hand or just unmute. Dr. Jairam,
yes, ma'am. I wanted to ask a question. I am from India. I'm Dr. Shubha from Biochemistry Department. I'm a professor and HOD of Mysore Medical College and Research Institute. I wanted to ask a question because sometimes what happens, the objectives of the study, what they're actually planning and what they have done the study is not aligned with that of the conclusions. So they would have actually done, for example, estimating a particular analyte in a study population. But conclusion, they would have told that, as you have mentioned in the previous slide, they would have told this will be a biomarker. This may be considered as a biomarker in this particular disease population, like that. What they would have just done was only the estimation of that particular analyte. So if the objectives are not aligned with that of the conclusion, will it be a major flaw, or will it be, can we give it as a comment and for improvability, like that?
Say that something like that would be considered a major comment. I wouldn't think that would be grounds for recommending reject unless the objectives were not that novel or interesting, and then they were saying things about the conclusion that were making the paper seem more interesting and worthy of publication. But if it was more just a disagreement, I would include that as a major comment and ask them to revise their conclusion to be aligned with their objectives. But I don't think I would consider that a fatal flaw in most cases.
One more point, ma'am, regarding the figures and tables. If there is a discrepancy in the figures and tables, the figures in the tables and in the text, if there is a discrepancy, then should we actually mention it and bring it to the notice of the author?
Yeah, that is something that reviewers should definitely look for, is if there's agreement between the tables and the figures and what's reported in the text. If you notice, even as a science editor, sometimes I'll do this, where it seems like maybe the count was off on the tables and so none of the tables agree with each other or something, then I'll make a general comment. But usually I'll point out a few examples and then ask them to carefully review it in their revision. But looking for agreement between what's reported in the text in the tables and figures is definitely something that a reviewer should look for.
Thank you, ma'am.
Of course, thank you. Were there any more questions about working as a reviewer? Okay, so now we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about responding to reviews as an author. So responding to reviewer comments as an author is also a pretty difficult task, especially when you're starting off as an early career investigator. So just a few notes about how to respond to reviewer comments and things to keep in mind when you're responding to reviewer comments. So first is that a request for revisions is not a guarantee that your paper will be accepted. Very often manuscripts are rejected due to a lack of responsiveness to authors. And you should also be as respectful and responsive as possible. I know we all take our work very seriously and it can be easy to take things personally, but you should always remember that reviewers are doing their duty as peer reviewers. I've never seen a paper accepted on its first submission, and you should always just assume positive intent. When you're responding to reviewer comments, you should respond to every single comment or question. And you should also revise the manuscript in addition to responding to questions in the reviewer response. It's also helpful to make things easier for the reviewers and editors by being specific regarding where the manuscript was changed, either using line numbers or paragraph and page numbers. So you can disagree with reviewers. Being responsive doesn't mean that you have to take every comment that they say as the truth. But you should be careful when you're disagreeing with them and provide a strong rationale for not complying with their suggestions. Even if you don't agree with the reviewers or comply with their revision, you should still revise your manuscript to address the comment. So for instance, if a reviewer asks for a sensitivity analysis that you don't think is appropriate, you should add a note in the discussion for why you didn't conduct that suggested analysis. And something to think about is that if a reviewer has a question, this might also be a question by a future reader. And so it's good to address it in the manuscript itself instead of just in the response to reviewers. If the reviews are discordant or disagree with the journal's guidelines, you should use the editor's comments for guidance. If the editor's comments aren't informative, you should also ask them for more guidance as needed. So for instance, EHP has pretty strict rules due to the Section 508 compliance for formatting figures, in that we don't allow people to use color to distinguish figure elements. So if you got a reviewer saying, oh, you should use colors to distinguish these two figures, then you could ask the editor and say, that's not my understanding of the journal's guidelines. How should I address this? And they can help you out. So as an example of how to disagree with the reviewers effectively, if a reviewer is telling you that you should not treat this borderline statistically significant finding as a finding and you should consider it a null result, how would you respond? So the best way to respond would be to be respectful, but also provide a strong rationale for not complying with the results. So in this instance, I've included a citation that the classification of results into significant and non-significant is arbitrary, and that we've added this to the discussion section as well. So as an example of what not to do when you're responding to reviews, this is an actual author query that I have edited heavily, but they said, I don't agree with the so-called quote unquote expert who reviewed our manuscript. The reviewer made a mistake. Figure 4, not figure 2, is directly relevant to environmental health, and your readership should benefit from our important knowledge. So what went wrong here? When you're responding to a reviewer's comment, you don't want to insult them. You should also, when you're appealing a decision, have an action plan for how to revise the manuscript. Again, even if you don't agree with the reviewers, if they didn't understand something, it's likely that a reader won't either. And so your manuscript should be clarified in addition to the appeal. Publication decisions are based on the quality of work, not the author's behavior. So you can be rude to us, but it doesn't really help you if the reviewer or editor is on the fence about your manuscript, and you don't want to harm your professional reputation because of one heated response. So I've also included some helpful resources. We have our own reviewers hub. We're also developing more training modules that will be forthcoming eventually. I've also included the COPE ethical guidelines for peer reviewers, as well as a Wiley step-by-step guide to reviewing manuscripts that uses a similar two-step approach that I've recommended. So now I'd like to open it up to any discussion, questions, comments, or any experiences that you all would like to share, either as a reviewer or as an author. Go ahead, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. It was actually one of the need of the hour topic because we actually write papers and we become authors, but we don't have a formal training in actually the reviewing process. This is actually a very good topic that it fills up the gap in this particular field. Thank you very much for this nice talk on this peer reviewing process. And one question I had, ma'am, you mentioned about the evidence of research misconduct. If you get any evidence of research misconduct in the article like that, can you give any examples for this so that?
So one example would be, we have anti-plagiarism software, but sometimes something that happened once was our anti-plagiarism software did not detect it, but the reviewer was the person who was plagiarized. So they noticed very similar sentences. So something like that would be evidence of research misconduct. Another potential thing that could be identified by the reviewers is a potential conflict of interest. So for instance, if you see that the authors don't have any conflicts of interest listed on the manuscript, but you know that someone works as a consultant for the software that they're using or something similar. So any ethical issues like that, you would want to note in the comments to the editors.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you for attending. Is there any other questions or comments? So we are developing additional training materials that we expect will be on our website at some point. So you can, of course, email me for the slides, but I would also appreciate it if you could let me know what you enjoyed or learned from this presentation, as well as any things you would like to see added as we develop these training materials. So I really appreciate you taking the time to attend today's workshop.